What's up guys, it's Mars from Audio Judgment and today we are going to do something interesting. Well, at least for me, hopefully for you too. Now, I don't know about the rest of the world, but if you lived in Eastern Europe, odds are excellent that you had one of these in your house. Most popular were Sony and Philips, and I got a Sony unit as a kid. I remember I was deeply impressed by it. It was compact, it was loud, and it had good bass. Basically, these were the standards back then. If you ticked these boxes, you were doing things right. After 25 years, I still have it, well, at least the speaker boxes, and they still work. So I'm curious to see how this speaker was designed. We're going to measure the frequency response, check out how they tune the enclosure, and also tear down the box to see what's inside and how the crossover design looks like. Let's go! So the first thing we are going to do is to inspect it visually and draw some conclusions just on what we see from the outside. Then we are going to measure both speakers and check out the results and if there are inconsistencies between the two. Finally, we are going to disassemble the box and check out the insides and the crossover design. So first things first, the exterior. I'm going to start with the back because that is the part which is the least interesting. And we can see that the enclosure is made out of particle board, which is probably the cheapest material that you can use for such an enclosure. The thickness is 9 millimeters, which is pretty thin in my opinion, but it somehow works. It is very lightly painted, mainly because you are never going to see the back, and this will help cutting down costs. If we look at the corners where the panels go together, we can see that the panels are cut in 45-degree angles at the edges. This is a nice touch and probably helps out with assembly. The back panel is somewhat recessed. I have no idea why. This makes the internal volume of the box smaller than it otherwise could be, or the exterior volume larger than it needs to be. Probably they didn't want the binding post to stick out of the box. I don't know, maybe we'll figure this out when we open up the box. If we move forward and inspect the top, bottom and side panels, we can see that they are wrapped in some kind of silver laminate. That makes the speaker look more premium, although underneath it's still the same thin particle board. Even though 25 years have passed and I can assure you they didn't stood idle in one place for a long period of time, this wrapping looks in pretty good condition. Finally, we can get to the front. And let's assess the damage first. Both speakers present the mid-range driver with the dust cap pushed in. I don't know who did this because I'm certainly not that abusive with my speakers, but that probably isn't a big deal. While that's not something to ignore, I'm sure it won't hinder the performance of the speakers. However, I can't say the same thing for that little tweeter over there. Basically, that little cap is the whole surface area of the tweeter. But no matter, the other speaker box was spared the tweeter punishment, and when we measure the speakers, I'll focus on the one in better condition. Okay, so what we got in the front? We got a quick edge woofer. That's because the woofer is on the edge, and you better believe it's quick. You gotta love that marketing from the 90s. The woofer is in very good condition. 25 years have passed and no signs of wear and tear. Usually the surround is the first one to age badly, but this one looks like new. The baffle is made out of some plastic material, probably to get this aggressive angular look on the speaker. Also to make this custom shape bass reflex port. This has an irregular area, but I calculated to be equal to a 2-inch cylindrical port, which seems about right for this size of woofer. I know from experience that this has a high excursion driver and a lot of air is moved through the port. Regardless of that, at high volumes there is minimal port noise. The port is well designed. If I look at how the speakers are mounted, I don't see no screws. This means that the speakers are mounted from the inside. And we shall get a bit wiser once we open up the box. But before we do any harm to this speaker box, let's do some measurements first. Let's start with the impedance first. And this tells us the resonant frequency of the box is at 50 Hz, which is what you would expect from this kind of speaker. Now let's go ahead and measure the frequency response. And here we have the response of both the left and right speakers. If you look on the left side here and see all of these measurements, this is because we measured the speaker indoors and not in an anechoic chamber. And to get around that, we have to make several measurements, do some calculations and splice measurements together, and then we get the full frequency response anechoically. If you want to learn how to do that, you can check out the loudspeaker measurements course. Now let's check the final response. This is quite interesting. It looks linear-ish with variations which slightly exceed the 5 decibels and sometimes have sharp dips or peaks. These may be the result of speaker deterioration, or the crossover parts are in bad condition or maybe failed altogether. I'm almost sure that it contains electrolytic capacitors, and after 25 years you can bet that they are not in good shape. If we look at the second speaker, we can see that the two responses don't match. This means that my theory holds true, which means one of the following happened. Mid-range or tweeter in bad condition, crossover components which are not working correctly, or cheap mid-range and tweeter speakers which exhibit inconsistencies between batches. If we look at the bass section, we can see that the responses match perfectly. This is expected as the woofers work fine, and most certainly there is no high-pass filter for it to alter the signal. Okay, now let's go ahead and check out what's inside. Now this is not what I was expecting, very underwhelmed by what I found inside. So if we take a peek inside the box, there is absolutely nothing except for some spider webs. The front baffle is made out of plastic. I don't know why, but I thought it was made out of particle board and just have that gray plastic on top for aesthetic purposes. But to be fair, it's easier to mold the mounts for the speakers in plastic. Since there is no more to talk about the box, let's talk about the speakers and the crossover. Oh, about the crossover, there isn't any. Unless you call that capacitor a crossover. I find it amusing how they wired the speakers, although it's kinda clever. They basically daisy chain them. The signal goes into the woofer first, then it goes into this capacitor, and from the cap it goes to the mid, and from the mid the same signal goes to the tweeter. So there is a first order filter for the tweeter, and the same filter is applied to the mid-range as well. And the cap has a very low value, 1.5 microfarads, which means that the theoretical crossover point is very high. I've never seen such aggressive cost cutting, but now that I look back at the frequency response, it's quite impressive because they did that with basically nothing. If I were to give an opinion on these drivers, they spend the most money on the woofer, rather a subwoofer because it has a very large excursion. The mid-range is a very cheap driver judging on how it looks, and the tweeter, what is that thing? It's basically an aluminum sheet which is stuck to the baffle using adhesive tape and two wires going to it. How does this thing even work? If someone wants to tell me in the comments what kind of tweeter this is, because I've never seen such a thing. Having finished inspecting the drivers, we are pretty much done reviewing this speaker box. In conclusion, the frequency response is below average, but taking into consideration all that cost cutting, I'm quite impressed with what the engineers from back then achieved. Apart from the woofer, which is of mediocre quality, everything else is really cheap stuff. So you gotta give Sony some credit for making something out of nothing. And that's a wrap for this episode. I hope I sparked some nostalgia for those who owned one of these audio systems. So make sure to give this video a like. Also subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.